The crystal spires of the royal palace stretched toward the twin suns of Luminara, their surfaces gleaming with stored stellar energy. Inside one of the quieter towers, Princess Dawn pressed herself against a wall, trying to make her tall but slender frame as small as possible. She didn't want anyone to see her here, especially not the royal guards. The young princess looked nothing like what most people expected of Lumini royalty, where others of her kind stood nearly 9 feet tall with broad, powerful frames that could channel massive amounts of stellar energy. Dawn barely reached 7 feet and had a build more suited to dancing than combat. Her crystalline skin, which should have pulsed with stored power, only gave off a soft, steady glow. As voices approached from around the corner, Dawn slipped into the library. This vast chamber, filled with knowledge from across the galaxy, had become her sanctuary over the years. Here, among the data crystals and ancient books, no one commented on her small size or her inability to properly channel energy through her crystal matrix. Dawn moved to her favorite spot, a quiet corner overlooking the capital city. She placed her hand on a nearby data crystal, and it responded to her touch, projecting images of various fighting styles from across the galaxy. The princess had spent countless hours studying these records, fascinated by how different species approached combat. "Still hiding in here, my daughter." The deep, resonant voice of King Starweaver filled the room. Dawn quickly shut off the projection, but not fast enough. "Father, I was just..." she started, but the king raised his hand, his crystalline fingers catching the light from outside. "You were studying combat techniques again," he said, his voice carrying neither approval nor disappointment. "Even though your teachers have told you repeatedly that your frame is not suited for our warrior arts." Dawn stood straighter, though she still only reached her father's chest. "The traditional methods might not work for me, but there must be other ways. Look at how many different species have developed their own combat styles based on their unique attributes." The king's expression softened slightly, his facial crystals shifting to show concern rather than authority. "Dawn, you are a princess of the Lumini. Our people expect certain things from their royal family. Your cousin Crystal can channel enough energy to power a small city. Your Aunt Reed can create weapons from pure stellar energy. And I can barely light up a room," Dawn finished bitterly. "I know, Father. Everyone reminds me daily." Starweaver moved to the window, his massive frame blocking out one of the suns. "The galaxy is changing. More species join the Galactic Council each cycle. Perhaps..." He stopped himself, shaking his head. "No, we must maintain our traditions. They have kept us strong for 10,000 years." Dawn watched her father leave, his powerful form radiating stored energy with each step. Once he was gone, she turned back to the data crystal and resumed her studies. The images showed creatures of all sizes and shapes, each fighting in their own unique way. Some used pure strength, others speed or technique. Many relied on weapons, while others turned their natural abilities into advantages. She paid special attention to the smaller species, the ones who had to survive among giants. Their methods were different, focused on using an opponent's strength against them, on finding weak points, on speed and precision rather than raw power. The library's artificial lighting began to dim, marking the approach of night. Dawn reluctantly prepared to leave her sanctuary, knowing she would have to attend the evening meal where, once again, she would sit among her powerful relatives and try not to feel completely out of place. As she walked through the palace corridors, her soft glow barely lighting her way, Dawn made a silent promise to herself. She would find her own path to strength, even if it meant looking beyond the crystal spires of Luminara. Somewhere in this vast galaxy, there had to be a way for someone like her to become strong. The arrival of the first human diplomatic ship caused quite a stir in the royal palace. Dawn watched from her favorite library window as the small vessel landed in the courtyard, its metal hull looking strangely dull compared to the crystal buildings around it. The gathered crowd of Lumini nobles towered over the human delegation as they emerged. Among the humans, one figure caught Dawn's attention. Unlike his companions who wore formal diplomatic robes, this human wore a simple dark uniform. He moved differently too, each step careful and balanced, his eyes constantly scanning his surroundings. Even from her high vantage point, Dawn could tell this human was a warrior, though he stood only about 5 feet tall. Later that evening, Dawn slipped out to her secret practice spot in the lesser gardens. Here, among the crystal flowers that gave off only the faintest light, she could attempt the traditional Lumini combat forms without anyone watching her fail. She tried again and again to channel energy through her crystal matrix, but produced only weak flickers of light instead of the powerful beams her people were famous for. "Your stance is too rigid," a voice said from behind her. "You're fighting against your own body." Dawn spun around, startled to find the human warrior from earlier standing there. Up close, he looked even smaller, yet something about his presence commanded attention. His hair was gray at the temples, and lines around his eyes suggested years of experience. "You shouldn't be here," Dawn said, trying to sound authoritative despite her embarrassment at being caught practicing. "These gardens are for royal family members only." The human gave a slight bow. "Jack Stone, combat instructor for the diplomatic corps." I got turned around looking for my quarters. His eyes twinkled. "Though I suspect you're not supposed to be here either, Princess." Dawn felt her crystal matrix pulse with surprise. "How did you know who I am?" "The way you carry yourself. Military training for 15 years teaches you to notice things." He gestured at the practice area. "Mind if I ask what you were trying to do?" Perhaps it was his casual manner, or maybe just the fact that he was the first person who hadn't immediately commented on her size, but Dawn found herself explaining the traditional Lumini combat forms. She demonstrated the movements, explaining how they were meant to channel stellar energy through specific crystal matrices in the body. Jack watched with genuine interest, occasionally nodding. "Interesting system, but it's built for someone with a different body type than yours. Like trying to force a speedboat to move like a battleship." "A what?" Dawn asked, unfamiliar with the Earth terms. "Never mind. Point is, you're trying to copy movements designed for warriors twice your size. That's why it's not working." He moved into an open space. "Want to see something different?" Without waiting for her answer, Jack began to move. His movements were nothing like the rigid, power-focused forms of Lumini combat. He flowed like water, each motion leading smoothly into the next. When he finished, he hadn't produced any energy beams or power displays, but Dawn found herself fascinated. "What was that?" she asked. "Just a basic kata, a practice form from Earth. We humans had to learn to fight without energy beams or crystal matrices. We developed thousands of different combat styles, many of them specifically designed for smaller fighters to defeat larger opponents." Dawn's crystal matrix pulsed with excitement. Could you teach me?" Jack looked around the garden thoughtfully. "It would be highly irregular, probably break about a dozen diplomatic protocols." He smiled. "Meet me here tomorrow, same time. Wear something you can move easily in." As he turned to leave, Dawn called after him. "Why would you help me?" Jack stopped but didn't turn around. "Because everyone deserves a chance to find their own way to be strong." Then he disappeared into the shadows of the crystal trees, leaving Dawn with more hope than she'd felt in years. Dawn hit the soft ground with a thud, her crystal matrix flickering with surprise. It was the 12th time Jack had thrown her down in their morning practice session, and she still couldn't figure out how such a small human could do it so easily. "That's enough for today," Jack said, offering his hand to help her up. "You're getting better." Dawn accepted his help, noting how 2 weeks of secret training had already changed how she moved. "Better at falling, maybe," she said, brushing off her practice clothes. "Learning to fall is the first step to learning how to fight," Jack replied. "A warrior who fears falling will never take risks." He walked over to a crystal bench and sat down. "Now show me that energy channeling thing again." Dawn took her stance, trying to focus stellar energy through her crystal matrix, as she had been taught since childhood. A weak glow appeared around her hands, nothing like the powerful beams her cousins could produce. "Stop," Jack said suddenly. "You're doing it exactly like they taught you, and that's the problem. Tell me, when you read in your library, does the data crystal respond to your touch?" "Yes, of course," Dawn answered, confused by the change in topic. "And when you're not thinking about it, your matrix glows steadily, right? It's only when you try to force it that things go wrong." Jack stood up and walked around her. "Your people developed their combat style based on their natural abilities, but they only focused on one way of using those abilities." He pointed to her hands. "Try this. Instead of trying to gather energy like your cousins do, just let it flow naturally, like moving your arm or taking a breath. Don't force it." Dawn closed her eyes, trying to feel the energy rather than control it. To her surprise, the glow around her hands strengthened slightly. "Good," Jack said. "Now remember that throw I just showed you. Try it again. But this time, let your energy flow with the movement." They practiced for another hour, with Jack showing Dawn how to combine human martial arts movements with her natural energy abilities. By the end, she had managed to create a small but focused beam of light that followed her hand movements like a ribbon. "It's not as powerful as traditional techniques," Dawn said, watching the light dance around her fingers. "No, but it's yours," Jack replied. "And sometimes precision beats power. Look at this." He pulled out a small device from his pocket and projected an image of Earth martial artists practicing. "These humans are doing a style called Aikido. They don't try to overpower their opponents. They redirect force instead." Dawn watched intently as the smaller fighters in the projection threw much larger opponents, using smooth, circular movements similar to what Jack had been teaching her. "Your crystal matrix might not store as much energy as other lumini," Jack explained, "but that means you can move it more quickly, shape it more precisely. Why try to be a hammer when you can be a needle?" Their training session was interrupted by the sound of approaching footsteps. Dawn quickly dimmed her energy glow, while Jack slipped behind a crystal tree. One of the royal guards passed by, scanning the garden briefly before moving on. "We're going to have to be more careful," Dawn whispered once the guard was gone. "If the royal court finds out about these lessons, they'll find out eventually," Jack said, emerging from his hiding spot. "The question is, will you be ready when they do?" Dawn looked at her hands, where small traces of light still danced between her fingers in ways she had never seen before. For the first time in her life, her smaller crystal matrix didn't feel like a weakness. "Keep teaching me," she said firmly. "I want to learn everything." Jack smiled. "Same time tomorrow then." "And Dawn." He paused at the garden entrance. "Bring those data crystals from your library. I think it's time we started creating something new. A fighting style that's truly your own." The news spread through the Crystal Palace like wildfire. Someone had seen Princess Dawn training with the human in the gardens. By midday, the throne room was filled with angry nobles, their crystal matrices pulsing with bright colors of outrage and disgust. Dawn stood before her father's throne, trying not to show her fear. Jack stood to one side, his face calm despite being surrounded by Lumini warriors who towered over him. The king sat silently, his expression unreadable as Dawn's cousin Crystal stepped forward. "This is an insult to our traditions." Crystal's voice boomed through the chamber, her 9-foot frame glowing with barely contained energy. "The heir to our throne, secretly learning primitive combat techniques from a human. She shames us all." King Starweaver raised his hand for silence. "Dawn, is this true? Have you been training with the human diplomat?" Before Dawn could answer, Crystal spoke again. "My king, as your niece and a true warrior of our people, I invoke the right of challenge. Let us settle this in the traditional way, through ritual combat." A murmur ran through the crowd. The right of challenge was an ancient tradition, allowing any noble to challenge the current heir's right to the throne. Dawn felt her crystal matrix pulse with fear. Crystal was one of the strongest warriors in the royal family. "You don't have to accept," Jack said quietly from beside her. "There must be other ways." But Dawn stepped forward, her voice surprisingly steady. "I accept the challenge." The throne room erupted in shocked whispers. King Starweaver leaned forward, concern visible in his crystalline features. "Dawn, think carefully. Crystal has been training in our ways since birth. She can channel enough energy to power a battleship." "The challenge will take place in 7 days," Crystal announced, her voice filled with satisfaction. "In the grand arena, before all our people. When I win, the throne will pass to someone worthy of our traditions." As the nobles filed out of the throne room, many shooting disapproving looks at Dawn and Jack, the king called his daughter closer. "Why did you accept?" he asked softly. "You know you cannot win in traditional combat." Dawn stood straighter, channeling a small but steady flow of energy through her matrix. "Who said anything about traditional combat? The ancient laws say ritual combat must follow the sacred forms, but they don't specify which forms." The king's eyes widened slightly as he understood. "You plan to use what the human has taught you." "I plan to use everything I've learned," Dawn replied. "Both human and Lumini techniques. It's time our people saw there's more than one way to be strong." Later, in the practice garden, Jack put Dawn through the hardest training session yet. They had 7 days to prepare for the biggest fight of her life. "Crystal will expect you to fight like a Lumini," Jack said, as he demonstrated a new throwing technique. "She'll try to overwhelm you with power, but remember what we learned. Redirect, don't resist. Use her strength against her." Dawn nodded, practicing the movement again and again. She added her own touch, letting a thin stream of energy flow through her fingers as she moved, creating patterns in the air that followed her movements. "I still can't produce the kind of energy beams that Crystal can," Dawn said, watching her light patterns fade. Jack smiled. "No, but you can do something she can't. Your control is perfect. You can shape your energy in ways she never learned. Sometimes the smallest blade is more dangerous than the biggest hammer." As the twin suns set, casting long shadows through the crystal gardens, Dawn practiced late into the night. She knew the next 7 days would determine not just her future, but possibly the future of her entire people. For the first time in her life, she felt ready to face that challenge. "Let's go through it one more time," she said to Jack. "Show me that movement again." 5 days before the challenge, Dawn crashed to the ground again. But this time she rolled smoothly back to her feet. Her crystal matrix hummed with steady energy as she faced Jack in their practice arena. "Better," Jack said, circling her slowly. "But you're still thinking of human techniques and Lumini energy as separate things. They need to become one style, your style." Dawn wiped sweat from her crystalline forehead. "I've been trying to copy your movements exactly, but something still feels missing." Jack picked up a fallen crystal flower from the garden path. "Watch this," he said, tossing it high into the air. "Traditional Lumini warriors would blast it with energy, right? Show me how you would handle it differently." As the crystal flower fell, Dawn moved in a circular pattern she had learned from Earth martial arts. But this time, instead of just moving her body, she let her energy flow naturally through her smaller crystal matrix. A thin ribbon of light followed her hand movement, wrapping around the falling flower like a gentle stream of water. The flower slowed its descent, caught in her energy ribbon, and landed softly in her palm. Jack's eyes lit up. "That's it. You're not just moving energy, or just using physical techniques. You're blending them together. Your smaller matrix lets you control energy with more precision than any traditional warrior." For the next few hours, they experimented with this new approach. Dawn stopped trying to copy either traditional Lumini moves or human martial arts exactly. Instead, she created flowing movements that felt natural to her body, letting her energy follow these movements in delicate but precise patterns. "Look at this," she said excitedly, drawing complex shapes in the air with threads of light that danced around her like silk ribbons. "I can make the energy move however I want." "And that's your advantage," Jack explained. "Crystal can generate more raw power, but she can only use it in straight beams and explosive bursts. You can weave your energy into nets, shields, or whatever you need. It's like the difference between swinging a club and using a fencing sword. Dawn practiced late into the night, combining different movements she had learned. She discovered that quick, circular Aikido steps let her create spiraling energy patterns that could deflect larger energy blasts. The flowing movements of Tai Chi helped her maintain constant energy output instead of trying to gather it all at once like traditional Lumini warriors. As the twin suns rose the next morning, Dawn showed her father what she had learned. King Starweaver watched in amazement as his daughter moved through a practice routine that looked nothing like traditional Lumini combat, yet made the air dance with lights and energy in ways he had never seen before. "This is different," the king said finally, "but I see strength in it. Not the raw power we prize so much, but something else, something new." "That's what I've been trying to tell you," Dawn replied, letting her energy ribbons fade. "There's more than one kind of strength. Humans taught me that. They've survived and thrived among species far stronger than them because they learn, adapt, and find new ways to use what they have." Jack stepped forward. "Your Majesty, your daughter has created something unique, a perfect blend of human technique and Lumini power. She's not weak, she's just strong in a different way." The king looked thoughtful. "Perhaps it's time our people learned this lesson too." He turned to Dawn. "2 more days until the challenge. Show me more of what you've learned." Dawn smiled and began to move again, her energy flowing around her in elegant patterns. For the first time in her life, she felt truly comfortable in her own form. She wasn't trying to be a traditional Lumini warrior anymore. She was becoming something new, something that had never existed before. And in 2 days, she would show everyone exactly what that meant. The grand arena of Luminara glowed with the light of 10,000 Lumini spectators. Their combined crystal matrices lit up the morning sky, creating a dome of living light above the fighting ground. In the royal box, King Starweaver sat straight and still, his face showing no emotion as he watched the 2 competitors enter. Crystal strode into the arena first, her 9-foot frame radiating power. Energy crackled around her like lightning, and each step left small burns on the crystal floor. The crowd cheered. This was what a Lumini warrior should look like. Then Dawn entered. At 7 feet tall, she looked tiny compared to Crystal. Her crystal matrix gave off only a soft, steady glow. Many in the crowd whispered and shook their heads. Some even laughed. Only Jack, watching from the diplomatic section, smiled quietly to himself. "Last chance, little cousin," Crystal called out, her voice echoing across the arena. "Give up now, and I'll make sure you keep a comfortable position in the court after I take the throne." Dawn didn't answer. Instead, she began to move in slow, circular patterns, just as she had practiced hundreds of times. Her energy flowed around her in thin, elegant streams, like glowing ribbons in the air. Enough of this human nonsense. Crystal gathered her power and fired a massive beam of energy straight at Dawn. The crowd gasped. Such an attack would normally start a fight after the traditional opening ceremonies. But Dawn was ready. She stepped sideways, her movement flowing like water, and twisted her hands in a circular pattern. Her energy ribbons wrapped around Crystal's beam, redirecting it harmlessly into the sky. Crystal's matrix flared with anger. She launched blast after blast, each one powerful enough to shatter stone. But Dawn moved through them all, sometimes dodging, sometimes redirecting, her energy ribbons dancing around her in complex patterns. She never tried to match Crystal's power. Instead, she let each attack flow past her or around her, just as Jack had taught her. "Stand still and fight properly," Crystal shouted, frustration clear in her voice. She charged forward, her entire body glowing with gathered power. This was the moment Dawn had trained for. As Crystal rushed at her, Dawn stepped forward instead of back. She moved into the attack, just like in Aikido practice, and let her energy ribbons flow with her movement. They wrapped around Crystal's larger form, using her own momentum and power against her. The crowd watched in amazement as the smaller princess threw her much larger cousin, adding Crystal's own energy to the throw. Crystal crashed to the ground with enough force to crack the crystal floor. Before she could recover, Dawn's energy ribbons wrapped around her in a complex web. Crystal tried to power her way out, gathering energy for another blast. But Dawn's web was too precise, too intricate. Each time Crystal tried to gather power, the web redirected it, turning her own energy against her. After 3 attempts, Crystal found herself tangled in her own power, unable to move or attack. The arena fell silent. Nothing like this had ever been seen in Lumini combat before. Dawn stood calmly, maintaining her energy web with small, precise movements of her hands. "Do you yield?" Dawn asked quietly. Crystal struggled for a moment more, then slumped in defeat. "I yield," she said, her voice echoing in the silence. The crowd erupted in cheers, not the polite applause they had given Crystal's display of power, but real, excited cheering. They had seen something new, something that challenged everything they thought they knew about strength and combat. In the diplomatic box, Jack smiled proudly. King Starweaver stood, his matrix glowing with approval, and maybe a little wonder. And Dawn, standing in the center of the arena, let her energy ribbons dissolve into beautiful patterns of light. She had done more than win a fight. She had shown her people a new way to be strong. 3 months after the challenge, the royal palace looked very different. The training grounds, once reserved for traditional Lumini combat practice, now held students of all sizes. Some were practicing earth martial arts moves, others were experimenting with energy control, and many were trying to combine both, just as Dawn had done. Dawn watched from a balcony as a small Lumini child successfully redirected an energy blast for the first time. The child's crystal matrix might have been smaller than average, but her control was excellent. Just like Dawn, she had found her own way to be strong. "Your new school is doing well," Jack said, joining her at the railing. He was dressed in formal Earth diplomatic clothes now, very different from the training gear he had worn during their secret practice sessions. "Our new school," Dawn corrected him. "I couldn't have done any of this without you." She gestured at the training grounds below, where Crystal was surprisingly helping teach a group of younger Lumini how to blend traditional power moves with the new techniques. "Crystal turned out to be a better teacher than I expected," Jack noted with a smile. Dawn nodded. "After our fight, she asked me to teach her some of the new methods. She said there's no point in having all that power if you can't control it properly." She laughed softly. "Now she's one of our best instructors." The king appeared behind them, his crystal matrix glowing with pride as he watched the training sessions below. "The other noble houses were skeptical at first," he said, "but after seeing what these new techniques can do, many of them have sent their children to learn. Even some of the older warriors are asking for lessons." "Change isn't always easy," Jack replied, "but sometimes it's necessary. Humans learned that lesson long ago. The species that survive aren't always the strongest, but the ones most willing to adapt and learn new ways." Below them, a group of students finished their practice session. They bowed first in the traditional Lumini way, then in the Earth style that Jack had taught them. Their crystal matrices glowed with different patterns and intensities, but each student had found their own unique way to blend the two traditions. "The human diplomatic mission is ending soon," Jack said quietly. "They're sending a permanent ambassador to replace us." Dawn turned to him, her matrix dimming slightly with sadness. "Will you be going back to Earth?" Jack smiled. "Actually, your father made an interesting offer. He thinks the new combat school could use a permanent Earth instructor, someone to help teach human martial arts and work with students to develop their own styles." "You're staying." Dawn's matrix brightened instantly. "If that's all right with the heir to the throne," Jack said with a small bow. "More than all right," Dawn replied. She looked out over the training grounds again. "We still have so much to learn from each other. This is just the beginning." The king placed a hand on his daughter's shoulder. You've done more than create a new way of fighting, Dawn. You've shown our people that strength comes in many forms, that tradition and innovation can work together. He looked at Jack. And you've shown us that sometimes the best teachers come from the most unexpected places. As the twin suns set over Luminara, casting rainbow lights through the crystal buildings, Dawn watched her students practicing below. Some were tall and powerful like traditional Lumini warriors, others were smaller like her, but each one was finding their own path, their own way to be strong. A small energy ribbon danced around her fingers as she thought about how far they had come. From secret practices in the garden to a whole new way of thinking about combat and strength, all because a human teacher had shown a weak princess that being different didn't mean being powerless. Ready for tomorrow's classes? Jack asked. Dawn smiled, letting her energy ribbon form complex patterns in the air. Ready to keep changing the world, one student at a time.